Okay, so hello everyone, welcome. My name is Danielle Guizzo. I'm one of the academic officers of the Association for Heterodox Economics. And together with my AHE colleague who's here with me, Ariane Agunsoye, I'd like to welcome you to our April webinar, which is part of our webinar series on Heterodox Economics Goes Global. And today I am thrilled to announce that we have two speakers. So we have Dr. Julia Braga and Dr. Ricardo Summa, both based in Brazil. And they will present a paper entitled Applications and Challenges of the Sraffian Supermultiplier. And Dr. Julian de Medeiros Braga is an associate professor at the Faculty of Economics at the Fluminense Federal University in Brazil. She worked as an economic advisor in the Ministry of Planning and Budget in Brazil, was also a visiting scholar at IPEA and in the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College in New York. And it's one of the directors of the Brazilian Keynesian Association. Her current research interests address the labor market and the supermultiplier theory and interest rate and exchange rate dynamics in emerging markets. And together with Dr. Julia, we have Dr. Ricardo Summa, who's a professor of economics at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. He's also the coordinator of the graduate program in economics at the same institution and a research fellow at CNPq, which is the Brazilian National Council for Scientific and Technological Development. And his research expertise is on the theoretical and empirical studies on demand-led growth, conflict inflation, and its relationship with macroeconomic policies. So we're going to have the presentation by Dr. Julia and Dr. Ricardo. And for the discussion, we have here with us Dr. Ricardo Pariboni. He's a lecturer in economics at the University of Siena in Italy. So he'll make a comment and raise a few questions for us during the discussion. And then after we have the presentation, the discussion, and a few questions and questions from the audience, we'll then go into a bit of a short informal discussion also about heterodox economics in Brazil as well. So Julia, Ricardo, and Ricardo Periboni, thank you so much for agreeing to be here with us today. So for the presentation, we have roughly 20 minutes. I can let you know once you have maybe 5 minutes to the end. Okay. And also for the participants, let me just let you know, so we're recording the presentation, and if we could keep ourselves muted for now, and then once we start with the Q&A session, then we can bring questions on the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask, that would be okay as well. And if you may be experiencing any technical issues, just drop us a message on the chat. Okay? So Julia, Ricardo, the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
So thank you, Danielle, for this invitation and for this wonderful opportunity to discuss the supermultiplier approach here with Ricardo and Pariboni. I see some familiar faces, actually names here. And so I made a small presentation that's going to guide my speech here. I will share with you. Is it okay? It's here already, right? Or not? Can you see it?
No, we cannot see. Maybe if you stop sharing and try to share again.
Okay.
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay. So we are going to talk about applications and challenges of the Sraffian supermultiplier. It's based actually on a paper that it's Ricardo Summa, it's one of the authors. So I assume that you are all familiar with the supermultiplier mechanism, the interaction between income multiplier and investment accelerator. It's actually an old idea that practically disappeared in the mid-1950s and was rescued by Serrano 1995, combining with the surplus approach. Let me just mind. Okay. Um, so the stability of the model was provided by Freitas and Serrano, 2015, and so only in 2015. And it's so they proved that the model does not suffer from Herod's instability. And now we can say that it's widespread, named as a broad class of autonomous demand-led growth models included in this broad class of models. And authors like Allen, Lavoie, Paley, and Fasari and Dutch has already um, made models in represented in this class of broad autonomous demand-led growth model. The foundation of the model, of the supermultiplier model, is the principle of capital adjustment. This is very important to understand. So the baseline model, it's for what it's common to every capitalist economy. And the model is flexible enough, as we are going to see, to adapt to different realities. So in order to motivate you, I put here this Twitter of Oliver Blanchard, responding to this other Twitter that claims that the US economy was underheated for basically the entire period after the great financial crisis. So Oliver Blanchard doesn't think that the economy was underheated. He said that it was actually a one-time decrease in the potential output. And he even joked that if it were like that, the economy would be operating at 50% of capacity since 1960s. So Oliver Blanchard definitely doesn't follow the supermultiply approach. If he followed the supermultiply approach, he wouldn't have implied a capacity utilization of 50%, because in this approach, if the demand falls to a lower level, stock of capital will slowly decrease. And this means that the degree of capacity utilization will increase again. So there is an adjustment, even if it does not return entirely to the previous level. And it is actually a level effect, but in order to avoid the decrease in of the capital, the stock of capital, autonomous demand must grow at a faster rate. So this red line here that I put it here is what an economist that follows the supermultiply approach would recommend for policymakers if he were like as influential as Blanchard is. So some common misconceptions of the model. Some say that it is for the long period, not for the short run. So I'd like to remember you that Samuelson's multiplier accelerator interaction model meant to explain business cycles. The other common misconception is the confusion. This is a more subtle one. It's the confusion between autonomous demand, so non-capacity creating autonomous demand, and exogenous demand. So the model assumes that non-capacity creating autonomous demand that guides growth, but autonomous, it's not exogenous. So it is autonomous from production decisions. So not systematically related with production decisions, but there is no closed theory for their determinants. But it can be endogenous to the income because, for instance, a policy rule. The other common misconception is that there is no room for autonomous investments, for instance, because of innovation. The point is, by the principle of capital adjustment, aggregate capacity creating investment must follow autonomous demand. So it is perfectly compatible with unjustified investment, whether because of technical change, animal spirits, or competition. But because of capital adjustment principle, if this generates an excess of capacity, other investments will diminish. So in the end, it's always justified by autonomous demand growth. Some extensions of the model have been developed to include more realistic elements into the supermultiplier model, extensions of the baseline model, uh, to cope with different components of autonomous demand and its determinants, to insert the role of macroeconomic policy with fiscal and monetary policy rules to determine autonomous components of the demand. Um, it applied to analyze concrete experience in advanced and developing economies. So this approach has flexibility to deal with different realities. And uh, also some extensions put constraints to the demand-led growth mechanism, policy external financial constraints to insert financial bubbles and crisis or conflict inflation. So this is just a list of these contributions. Um, so ones that deal with autonomous components of investments, it can be dealt with by different ways. For example, by autonomous expectations, as in Serrano, Freitas and Bering, innovative innovation investment as shocks in the expected growth rate, as Cesarato in 2003, technical progress in the investment function as Neff and Lavoie 2019, and the relation of investment with real interest rate by Ducci 2020. Also, this the whole of real interest rate in the determination of autonomous demand, the short run questions. Monetary policy can influence expenditure in durable goods, consumption, and residential investment, as in Summa, 2016, Serrano, Summa, and Garrido Moreira, 2020. And also demographic factors and residential investment growth. So the pattern of this kind of non-capacity creating autonomous demand in advanced and stable countries with regulated and well-behaved labor, credit and real estate markets, and strong social security coverage by Allen 2019. Financial constraints to autonomous demand growth was studied in the perspective of a stock and flow consistent approach, which is, by the way, another common criticism of the model, of the baseline model. It's just a flow model, not a stock and flow consistent. It's not true. You can adapt. So to include workers' debt to income relation, as in Ricardo Pariboni that is here, 2016, Mandarino 2020, residential investment in households debt by Petrini and Teixeira, 2020. Public debt to output relation by Freitas and Cavalcanti, 2020. Indebtedness of the non-financial business sector by Freitas and Gautier. So external constraint, which is important here in Latin America, was also studied by Serrano and Souza, 2000, and Medeiros and Serrano, 2006. External imbalances and unsustainable path of foreign debt to export ratio. Maximum accepted level of foreign debt to export ratio was studied by Berenguer, 2019. Real resource constraints as in labor force and productivity was studied by Paley, 2019, Fazari, 2020, Neff and Lavoie, 2019. And the only that it was important here to explain our period in Brazil here of growth in the 20s was it's the policy constraint demand-led growth. When it's related to conflict inflation and inflation targets and other policy rules by Summa in 2006 and Serrano 2019. So this research agenda, there are a lot of topics theoretically that can be included in the baseline model, and also there is this also agenda that deal with the empirical and applied versions of the supermultiplier model. What I particularly find it's that the accelerator is very easy to obtain econometrically. The consumption function, the multiplier, not so easy, because since non-capacity creating autonomous, the whole point of the model of the first contribution of Serrano was to assume that autonomous consumption was not constant. So, and generally, the non-capacity creating autonomous demand, it's not constant over time. So you must properly identify these components of autonomous consumption and separate it from induced consumption. And not so easy as well is to differentiate the impact of individual components of the autonomous demand, since it is the group as a whole that of non-capacity creating autonomous demand that is important to explain the income, the level and the trend of income. So some papers of this empirical and applied versions of the supermultiplier model that use different methodological approach, econometric tools for different countries and periods. Mine PhD thesis, first of all, 2006, that explained the U.S. Growth in the 90s. MEDSI, 2011. Girardi and Pariboni, 2016, 2020, Fiorito, 2018. Another one of my paper, 2020, to explain Brazilian economy. Pérez, Montiel, and Urbina, 2020. Fazari et al., 2020. Girardi et al., 2020. And Guilherme Halushka, that is here with us as well, 2020. So, and also there are attempts to insert this macroeconomic view into a multi-sectorial, including the input-output matrix. So the supermultiplier models calibrated by empirical data, Fabio Freitas Externo Eck, 2020, Cornélio Freitas and Bussato, 2018, Portela Garbo, 2016, Portela Garbo and the Juan, 2019. I'm sorry to bother you with all this reference, but I think it's important since we are here, presenting all this agenda and how it evolved along all these years. There are a lot of contributions already. And simulations of the supermultiplier mechanism with stylized calibrated pattern, uh, calibrated parameters was done by Haluska, Summa, and Serrano. I think I will stop here. Let me return for you so I can see you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Julian. Thanks. Okay, can I ask Ricardo Pariboni to come and make some comments, questions?
Sure. Thanks, Danielle, and thanks, Julia, for the brilliant presentation. Well, as you might have guessed, I'm quite sympathetic with the approach. I'm working in this approach as well. So, for the sake of discussion and in order to make things interesting, I'll play to some extent the devil's advocate. So, there is in particular one objection, one criticism I'd like to raise, not because I believe this criticism is correct. To the contrary, I believe it's part of the misconception Julia was trying to dissipate, but still, it's one of the standard things that I am asked when I present supermultiplier-like models at conferences and so on and so forth. So a very standard objection goes as follows. So it looks like in supermultiplier-like models, there is one single variable called autonomous demand, whose rate of growth has to be more or less constant or at least quite stable in order to work as an attractor of the rate of growth of the economy. So the critiques goes and follows by saying, but look, as you're telling me, autonomous demand comprises several different subcomponents. So how can it be to have a constant or a steady or a stable single rate of growth for the single variable? So this will be the argument I would like to bring to the table to hear from Julia and Ricardo. And then there is, and then I'm done, something more of a comment, something that I believe is extremely important, something that you can find in Julia's slides and in her words. And I believe this is a very important to highlight. So one important aspect of the autonomy of these components of demand is not, and I stress it, is not that there is no relation at all with production decision or with output. To the contrary, the very important part is that there is no necessary functional relation between production decision and output and autonomous demand. And it always comes to my mind an analogy with reasoning developed by Ricardo when he argued about David Ricardo, not Ricardo Summa, when he argued about the fact that it makes a lot of sense to study prices of production and production as belonging to different logical stages, not because the level of production doesn't matter for prices, but simply because as long as we cannot determine a necessary, strict functional influence of production on prices, it makes sense to study the two as belonging to different stages. So in this sense, autonomous demand is autonomous exactly for this, because yes, there might be specific policy rules, specific institutional arrangement, specific period of times in which some relation might be at work, but no necessary one. So this was more of a corroboration of what Julia said. Okay, for me it's enough. Thanks.
Okay, I will just start to answer, then Ricardo can complement. So Serrano always said that when he was in his PhD and he was defending his PhD thesis, that his advisor asked him, so all you are doing in this very closed and baseline model, all you are doing is to assume that autonomous consumption it's not constant over time. And he answered that, yes, but it works. So this criticism that it's a single variable that it's constant over time, I don't think that it suits the model. It's not constant. It's just that we don't know how it's going to be. It depends on other situations. It's not internal to the model. And it's, yes, it's a single variable, but actually it's not, it's just a group of variable that you can in a second moment differentiate it and study each component, how it combines together. So yes, it's a single, but it's like a single because it's a group of variables. And then you can, in a second moment, differentiate their determinants.
Okay, maybe I can add something. Yes, I agree with Ricardo. He said these criticisms are not correct, since, as Julia said, just to start, as the model is applied to the data, to empirical data, of course, the real data on autonomous demand, in which you put in your econometric exercise, is from the real world and it's not constant. So the model works with non-constant data, and it's proved in many empirical papers. This is just to say that it's not correct because of this. But of course, you have two stages of analysis, as Ricardo Pariboni said. You can separate something, we would say, like a theory of the supermultiplier, and then the model. You know? The theory is much more general and has to do about principles. For example, the capital stock adjustment principle, the idea that part of the wages generating the production process are consumed by workers. These are much more general, and it's related to the theory, and this is why you say there's both consumption and investment are induced. And then what you don't have a very general theory to explain, you call autonomous demand, which do not create capacity. And then, of course, from the point of view of theory, you can think a lot of different relations for this, to explain each component of autonomous demand. And of course, they will not, from the point of view of theory, they must not be constant, because like political rules or political decisions like fiscal policy, there are a lot of very difficult, there are lags, there are political pressures between groups, difficulties to make like a budget to be spent, a lot of course, from the point of view of theory, there must not be constant, as well as residential investment or durable good consumption. We know they depend on the interest rate, they depend on financial conditions, they depend on the indebtedness of households, etc. But then, as then you go from this stage to the model stage, and the idea of this baseline model is to make it very simple, to stress the main properties of the model, like some methodological way to do it. And then you can analyze like the stability conditions. You can analyze relations. What happens if the wage share changes, for example? And then you can compare with other very simple as well. For example, the baseline New Kaleckian model, for example, which is also demand-led. For example, in the baseline New Kaleckian model, you have an animal spirit in the investment function, which is constant. So, okay, of course, proponents from this, from the point of view of theory, they don't believe animal spirits is something constant. Animal spirits must be very unstable, but in the baseline model is treated as constant. So you can use this kind of methodological devices to have more general results. And then what I think Julia tried to show, then you can investigate, you can research more about these determinants from also from the point of view of the model, and introduce what happens if you introduce fiscal policy and government debt, what happens if you introduce consumption, durable good consumption and household debt, and etc. And of course, I think a further step is to introduce all the components of the whole model. And what I think is interesting, there's some, as Ricardo said, they must not be constant, all of these components, but of course, you cannot have one of these components growing much more than the others for the whole, like for a long period, because the share of one expenditure in autonomous demand will increase, and the others will tend to zero. So of course, I think one interesting, maybe we can move forward to analyze, is the interdependence between the autonomous components of demand growth and financial fragility, or the sustainability of this process. And then I'm thinking about, for example, when you are expanding the economy, and I think Brazil is a good reference here, Julia mentioned, with fiscal policy and consumption based on credit. And then you slow down the government spending, growth rate of government spending, and this will affect the relation between debt and income in the household sector, which will also work in the direction to slow down the consumptions from households. So this, I think, is something we can move forward, because it's true that all the components will not grow on the same rate, even on average in the short or medium run. But on the other side, they are not completely independent from each other, since expenditures from one sector and debts have feedbacks or have a consequence on the income of the other sectors. So this, I think, we still don't have this full model with all the sectors and debts, but I think this, the way I see the research going, I would like to see this.
Can I add something? I mean, I agree with you 100%. There is something I would like to add. I mean, about the components of autonomous demand. My impression is that, for example, the supermultiplier model provides a reasonably easy and manageable tool to examine the interaction between external constraints to growth and fiscal policy, which is basically the problem for demand-led economies, for all the demand-led economies in the world, unless you are the US. So I believe that's really or at least based on my interest, that's the most interesting, perhaps one of the most interesting thing to investigate in the near future and in our research agenda, because as you were saying, even if there is no reason for these components to grow at the same or at a similar rate of growth, well, at the end of the day, you cannot even have government spending growing constantly faster than export growth, because otherwise you would observe an explosion of your public debt to GDP ratio. And the same goes in the other direction, because you also have to take into account the accumulation of foreign debt. So I strongly believe that the analytical tool you're using is the one that provides the easiest and more reasonable path to analyze these issues.
Do you guys want to respond to that, or?
Yes.
I agree.
I agree, yes. But you also have to include the international reserves, because you can, for a while, maybe you can experience this kind of pattern of growth. So I think that you have also need to include the stock of international reserve of the country. This is mainly the situation that we have here in Brazil, although we are exporting a lot, but for a while we could grow with government spending greater than exports, because we have enough international reserve to support this kind of growth. But for a while, you are completely right.
Okay, shall we open to the floor to questions from the audience? I'm not sure if anyone would like to ask something to Julia and Ricardo. You can drop it on the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask.
I can send the slides, and there is also Ricardo's Summa paper that it's, I don't know if you can, it's not yet, it's a working paper.
No,
right, Ricardo?
yeah, it's not. It's a work in progress. It's still not finished. I just share with Ricardo Paribon.
Yeah, maybe
and Julia.
some months we can send.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you can send the presentation to us. We can put it on the website, and
definitely.
once the paper is published, we can put the link as well.
Okay.
So it seems that we have a question from José Bruno Fevereiro on the chat. So considering the interest of the heterodox community in analyzing the relationship between income distribution and economic growth, which is captured by the new Kaleckian profit-led and wage-led debate, my question for the speakers is to clarify what is the view that emerges from the supermultiplier approach regarding this relationship. Does an increase in the wage share increase or decrease the rate of growth, or do we have only a level effect? And subsequent question, so following that, does any of the extensions developed have shown results that reverse key conclusions from the baseline model?
Sorry, okay, I will see here in the chat.
Yes, okay. So I can begin this one. Joanna Davi Abitzer it's here as well. She has a paper with me and Fabio Freitas that it's going to be published, I think, this year on Nova Economia, which is a review from the Federal University of Minas Gerais. And we discuss this relation of profits-led and wage-led within the supermultiplier approach. Basically, so in this approach, distribution, it's outside of the model, so you can have different results of distribution. You don't have to have one type of wage or profit led. And a wage share increase would be a level effect, not a growth effect. And the other one, does any of the extensions develop? Well, there are attempts to criticize the baseline model, but I don't think they are well succeeded.
Maybe I can add something. Also, maybe Ricardo Pariboni could respond to this first question, because he also published a paper in Roque about this. But so I'll not, and Julia already answered. I'll talk about the number 2. Does any of the extensions developed have shown results that reverse K conclusions? Well, there are some models which include consumption based on wealth. Like, for example, Lydia Brochere and Macedo e Silva, that some results are changed when you include this consumption based on wealth. And for example, the wage share has a effect on growth. No, there's the same relation between changes in distribution and growth. But other papers which does not include this wealth effect also from Lydia Brochere with Fabio Freitas, because Fabio Freitas does not like this effect. And in fact, in the heterodox discussion, for example, Kalecki was very against this idea of, he criticizes Pigou on this wealth effects on consumption. And the idea is that in the real world, it's not like the consumption based on wealth from rich people. The idea is that the propensity to consume must be very low, and in the end depend also on credit and in the aggregate. But so the papers using stock flow consistent models or Godley's approach without this wealth effect on consumption. The results remain the same. Like there's this paper by Mandarino which reaches the same results from Pariboni's paper using a Godley's approach without this effect, and the other papers by Fabio and Lydia Brochet also. The same results keep the same. Well, there's other extensions. There are a lot of things. I think Danilo is here. Danilo Spinola. He's here, and he also includes this wealth effect and propose a different closure to the model. The idea is that demand accommodates to supply and not the opposite. Yes, the literature is growing, and there are some different views on the model. But yes, maybe the one that changed that Jose asked is Lydia Brochet and Macedo Silva.
So we have a couple more questions from the chat. So I'm going to read the two that came up from Sandeep and from Andrew Trigg. And then Danilo also wants to ask a question, so I'm going to ask him to raise. So I'm just going to read. So Sandeep is asking, is anyone working on this Rafa's work to analyze inflation behavior around the world? And Andrew Trigg's question is about, under duality, might income distribution, so wages and profits, be separate in this Sraffian price system from the supermultiplier quantity system? So those are the questions that we have. And then Danilo, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, hello, thank you, Danielle. Hi, Julia, hi, Summa, thank you for the presentation. It was really nice. My question, it goes a bit in the direction that you mentioned, Summa, about the accommodating between supply and demand. Because one thing I realized in the model, and something that we had this conversation before, but something I have been thinking about, is the fact that in the long run for this demand-led model, then you have the autonomous consumption being the growth of autonomous consumption being the gravitational point that attracts the growth rate, including the growth rate of supply. But then there is no, I couldn't see explicitly in the model an explicit mechanism by which supply would then adjust, in the sense that supply needs to adjust either by growth of population or by growth of labor productivity. But then in order to employment to be stable in the long run, and then you have that the model is consistent with the supply adjustment, you need that either the growth of population or the growth of the working population or the growth of labor productivity to be adjusting. But then there's no explicit mechanism from which, and this is actually what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to find an explicit mechanism in which we have a demand-led growth that can be compatible with employment stability. And that's why, in the end, what my paper did was try to do the reverse. We got the Schumpeterian literature and said, well, supply grows according to technological development, and then demand ends up stabilizing the system. But then my question is regarding, have you guys thought a little on this adjustment in which supply needs to be accommodating the demand growth? Because sorry, I'm not being too long on my question, but if you just have like labor productivity, the populational growth adjusting, you'd have like a kind of a Malthusian mechanism in which population grows according to growth, so to economic growth. But then what we see is that actually labor productivity plays an important role. So my question is, like, have you guys been thinking about that? Is that a problem that has come to the agenda, and what are the things that we have been discussing on right now? And thank you again for the presentation. It was quite interesting.
Do I respond?
Yeah, as you
Okay.
wish.
I will start with Andrew's trig question about the how to incorporate inflation in this model, and I think also the question by Danilo will go in the same direction in the end, because of course I agree that you have a separation between prices and output from this Sraffian perspective, and you from the dynamics of output and capacity, you have, if the growth rate is not so high, if you don't have other constraints, you go to equilibrium with normal utilization, etc. And so there's no, even if you have inflation, for example, if the growth rate changes too fast and there are some, I don't know, some problems to expand capacity in the short run and have inflation, but in the medium or long run, you share this output gap endogenously when capacity, productive capacity increases. So inflation from this point of view is not a big issue, because you don't have a permanent output gap, since you have this endogenous mechanism. But inflation, as we see, comes from cost push inflation, which can happen even much before you have scarcity of labor, and wages can increase if bargaining power of workers, for example, are more, if have a higher effect on bargaining power from workers to increase wages. And this can happen with, for example, low unemployment rates or low and long-lasting unemployment rate, but also from other institutional and political and social factors. For example, policy transfers from the government, minimum wage policy, and there's the role of unions and a lot of things you can consider in this. So there's no clear relation between growth and inflation from this perspective, but of course, as the growth rate, if the growth rate of autonomous demand and then output and capacity is higher, and then you have a lower unemployment rate for a long time, and this expanding economy in general is a result from, for example, fiscal policy and transfers. This can also increase workers' bargaining power, and you can have a relation not so systematic between growth and inflation. And then I go to Danilo's question. Yes, there are some, as Julia showed in her presentation, there are some attempts to incorporate, let's say, the supply side of the model, not only capacity. No, the idea of the theory and the model is that you have more scarcity of capital than labor, so it's quite fine to have this, if the growth rate is not so high, to adjust the capacity, and then something will happen with the unemployment rate. And this is what Danilo is asking, because if, for example, autonomous demand grow at 2%, it's different than if it grows 4%, because in one situation, if labor productivity is not so high, and if the population, the population that can work also does not grow so high, you can, if the growth rates of autonomous is too high, you can go to like zero unemployment. And then, of course, you have a scarcity of labor, and then you have this demand inflation, this very pure demand inflation. But what, for example, Fazari shows that there's a range in which you can grow, and there's some endogenous mechanisms of productivity and growth, a relation between productivity and growth, like Caldor, etc. And you can find it empirically, this relation, and also some slow mechanisms of adjustment from the labor force to growth. And this evolves more, it's not so fast as productivity, but involves, like, for example, immigration, or change in the participation rate, the people enters the labor force, or young people enter the labor force, or retired people return to the labor force. So you have these movements, and of course you cannot grow like 30%, and you reach labor scarcity, but there's a range in which you can grow. There's these endogenous mechanisms, one of them faster than others, and there's also a range of unemployment rate you reach compared to the growth rate of autonomous demand. And then the final link is between this unemployment rate and inflation and conflict inflation. These things we are working now.
Excellent. Guys, can I ask for us to go maybe to the second part for us to discuss? So to the participants, so the proposal of our webinar series is to have speakers from other heterodox networks around the world to present their papers, but also for us to discuss a little bit heterodox economics in different contexts. So we've asked Julia and Ricardo to maybe say a little bit about how heterodox economics is in Brazil, and how important is heterodox economics in their context. So can we maybe discuss that a little bit? I know you've prepared a short presentation, but we can do like an informal chat on that.
Okay, Ricardo, you can go first now.
Yeah, I think mine is more general. Then I will talk about in Brazil in general. Then Julia will talk about from Brazilian Keynesian Association. No? AKB. Okay. This is my very short presentation. It's only 2 slides. I think heterodox economics in Brazil is, compared to other parts of the world, is very well developed, in the sense there are a lot of institutions in which young heterodox economists can enter and can have a way to keep researching in a professional way. No? So this is not this is a result, of course, of a long tradition, and with a lot of important people that work for the whole life to make things like this. It's not like something that just happened. I would say, like, you have in Brazil some important heterodox economists. I would say Celso Furtado maybe is the most known. He was a minister in Brazil. He wrote very important books from the history, the economic history of the Brazilian economy, and there's a relation between his work and the Latin America structuralist tradition from that also influenced and was influenced by Eclac, and you have Prebisch in Argentina and others in Latin America. And Celso Furtado is one of the most important between them. But Celso Furtado did not have a academic career in Brazil, building institutions, etc. Although he was very important and still influenced, his work is still influenced in all the universities in Brazil. But I would say Maria da Conceição Tavares was this person that was very important to build these institutions, and she was very important to establish I think the two most old and important programs in heterodox economics, which is Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, which I work, and Unicamp. And she formed a lot of professors and researchers that are now very important and are a reference. I will not put everybody here because there's a lot of people, but she is the one that had this very important institutional mission to build, to consolidate heterodox economics in Brazil. Also, you have Fernando Cadinho de Carvalho, which is very important for the dissemination of Keynesian, post-Keynesian economics in Brazil, and also with a lot of former students, but now consolidated researchers. He was related to the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And you have others like Mario Postas, etc., which are formed by Conceição Tavares, Franklin Serrano, Carlos Medeiros, Wilson Cano, many others that were very important to build this structuralist, old developmentalist and heterodox program in economics. I would say besides Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and Unicamp, we have very big departments. Just to have an idea, in Federal University we have almost 100 professors, not all heterodox, but great part of them, the majority. And Unicamp, I think, is not so big, but it's quite big also a majority of heterodox. And you also have other universities like Federal Fluminense, which Julia is a professor, also a big university. And I think the majority is heterodox. Maybe Julia can correct me. Federal University of Minas Gerais, Rio Grande do Sul, etc. Have some university in Northeast, in the north of Brazil, some new university like Federal University of ABC in São Paulo, or Rural University of Rio de Janeiro, which are they face some expansion, or they were created or suffers expansions in the period of the Workers' Party government. They now are creating heterodox programs in graduate programs, the higher level, forming masters and PhDs. Another important, just to mention, as coordinator of the graduate program in economics in Rio, up to now, we formed almost 600 master students and almost more than 360 PhD students since '79. So a lot of people, and they go to this other, or to the same university, to other universities in Brazil, and now abroad. Have a lot of former students here in this talk that went to do the PhD in other universities outside Brazil. Beside of this big group of universities, you have also journals which accept heterodox papers. There are some which are just accept heterodox papers. I think Brazilian Keynesian Review, review of CEP, which is Economia Política, Political Economy Society. And you have Brazilian Review of Political Economy, which is led by Professor Bressa Pereira, which is much more heterodox than orthodox. There's some journals linked to Unicamp, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and all these universities, most of them have some a journal. We have also some associations like Political Economy, Brazilian Political Economy Association, which is more predominant Marxist. We have Brazilian Keynesian Association, which is, as the name said, Keynesian, post-Keynesian. And we have Industrial Economics Associations, New Schumpeterian. We have an association with all the graduate programs in economics in Brazil, which the heterodox part is a minority, but the heterodox has some presence also in the annual conference. Just there's an agreement that the keynote speaker, the main keynote speaker, in one conference in 1 year will be from the orthodox side and the mainstream side, and the other one from the heterodox side. And there's some annual conference of all of these associations, big ones. I don't know, maybe Julia has the numbers, but I don't know, maybe in the Brazilian Keynesian conference, there may be, I don't know, 50 papers or more. And political economy also, I think. And also in Unpack, which is you will always have 1 or 2 sessions in which the scientific committee is more heterodox friendly, and then you have some heterodox papers presented as well. We have scholarships from master and PhD financed by the Brazilian education, I don't know the name exactly, CAPES, which finance the scholarship. It doesn't matter if it's orthodox, heterodox. It's finance in broad sense these programs. And you also have fellowships from CNPq for researchers. And also there's some balance between orthodox and heterodox. There's a kind of agreement that all of this research is relevant, and you cannot restrict financing the heterodox research. I think that, and finally, I will promote a little bit here the International Workshop on Demand-Led Growth, which is also a conference we started in 2018, the Political Economy Research Group at Federal University of Rio, but with friends around the world and in Brazil, like Julia, and people from Argentina, and a good relation with our friends from Italy, like Ricardo. And we promote two conferences in Rio in 2018 and 19. It was a good, I think it was very, we had very good results. We published a symposium in Review of Keynesian Economics with some papers from 2018 to 2019. The conference was even bigger, but now 2020 we had the pandemic, and 2021 it will be virtual. In July, the call for papers is open, so I hope you can see each other in July. I invite you to submit papers and to watch the presentations, and I would be very thankful if you can share this information with people that may be interested.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you
will
so
do.
much.
We will do, Ricardo. Thanks. We will post the link afterwards for sure. So yeah, we still have a few more minutes for discussion and questions. And there is a question on the chat from Felipe Almeida. What is the criteria that was applied to affirm that a graduate program is heterodox? So in the classification, there are very orthodox programs as two institutions. So what do we consider for saying that a program is heterodox?
Oh, sorry, I made some very general. I did not. I can say I'm sorry if I made I committed some mistakes here in classifying. I would say, for example, UNB is not heterodox. Some programs are called pluralistics. Even from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, we declare ourselves as pluralistics, as we have some professors working on mainstream research agenda. And maybe I was wrong to say that UFIS and Paras, but there are some heterodox research in these programs. I think there's some Keynesian, some Marxist people working from the point of view of regional economics or development or regional development. So, okay, maybe it's not so strict. I'll say that there are even like in University of São Paulo, it's clearly not heterodox, but there are some heterodox economists, researchers, and professors there. There are some heterodox theses, there are some dissertations, etc. And I believe in all of this. Felipe mentioned. I'm sorry if I'm not very strict, just to have an idea that there are some heterodox economists working in different institutions around Brazil, and there's some space. And of course, the degree of space they have can change, but there's some space.
So I have a question actually about that. So I wonder if participants have more questions. If not, I'll use my power as chair to ask my question. But I do have a question about what do you guys think about the future of heterodoxy in Brazil? Because in Brazil, you do have a good space to be a heterodox, and heterodox is quite representative. So many institutions, associations, journals. But what do you think it's going to happen in the future? Do you think that space will still be protected or not?
What do you think, Julia?
Difficult to answer, but I think that there is a more profound problem because the public universities are under attack by by the government, and a lot of people that argue that the public university have a lot of funds and they wanted to cut funds to and finance to the university, the public university. So I think that the public university is very important for the heterodox to grow and to maintain the space, because when you are heterodox, it's more difficult to raise funds from private sector.
Yes, I think I would add that like austerity that came in like 2015, let's say. Also, since then, we don't have so many positions open to enter as professor, but even in Bolsonaro's government or Temer, etc., there are some people, heterodox economists hired in public examinations. They compete and they make it. But of course, in a much slower pace than before, and we don't know what will happen in the future, because with the pandemic, the universities are not open physically. We have some possibility to hire, but some problems with how to make this exam, which is public, and maybe must be in person, but the university is closed. There are a lot of problems to continue hiring people since the pandemic's getting even worse. But I think this is one trend. But on the other side, we had a very big expansion in 2000, like let's say 2006 until 2014, maybe. And a lot of people enter. So these people will continue working, and I hope so. Continue working research, and I think you have some time. This will have a long-lasting effect. Also, if you don't have so many scholarships or finance, etc., our students are going abroad for other funding, universities which are funding PhDs.
There is actually a
Scholarship,
question.
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but there's a question about that on the chat about postdoc programs. So is this the similar process? I guess we have people interested in maybe.
Yes, we have still a program with scholarships from PhD from postdocs, and it worked very good since last year. It's of course quite easy. You have like a permanent, for example, in our program, we have 2 permanent scholarships, and you can nominate you can nominate which researcher will be the, of course, we make public competition to decide. But since last year, they keep the people that was receiving the scholarship, the fellowship, PhD, the postdoc fellowship, but did not permit to include more other postdoc research. So this program, they said, we'll change the things. We are reformulating the program, but it was like 1 year ago. So since then, for example, our 2 postdoc researchers enter in the departments, university as professors. So we don't have more postdocs now in our program because you cannot nominate new ones. If I enter in the system, I can see we have the 2 scholarships, but we cannot include more now. For now, there's a message you cannot include at this moment. We don't know. There's still no clear. It's not clear what will happen. There's some, I think, 3 changes in the CAPES presidency in the last 2 years. And the new one was, she was like 2 weeks ago, and we don't know what will happen. We depend on this.
Okay, I guess we're coming to the end. So I just want to thank you, Ricardo, Julia, and Ricardo Pariboni for coming. It was a very interesting discussion, very great presentation. And just before we go, so if you guys don't mind sharing either the slides or more information about when your paper will be available, and also about the conference that you are organizing, we're happy to share that on the website. And for the participants, just so you are aware, we have our next webinar in a month's time on the 28th of May. And that's going to be with Dr. Lorena Lombardozzi from the Open University on a talk on state capitalism and structural transformation in China. Okay. So again, guys, thanks so much for coming, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you,
Take care.
Danielle.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
It was great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much
Bye,
for the
Danielle.
invitation.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.